So you want to learn about how African culture has influenced America. Well, get ready, because we're about to take a deep dive into that very topic, guided by your questions and a whole stack of books and articles.
And we're not just talking about surface level stuff here.
Yeah.
We're going deep, exploring those cultural connections that run much deeper than a lot of people realize.
Right. And one of our main guys is going to be this book, Africanisms in American Culture, edited by Joseph E. Holloway. It really gets into those enduring traditions and how they've woven themselves into the fabric of American life.
It's a huge topic. We're talking everything from religious practices like voodoo and Santeria to even the roots of African American English and the food on our plates.
Okay, so let's jump right into it with the big question. How much of African culture actually survived slavery? That's what the whole Herskovits-Frazier debate is about.
Exactly. You've got Melville Herskovits, who argued that you can definitely see Africanisms, those elements of African culture retained, especially in places like the Caribbean and Brazil, where you had these large African populations and more cultural continuity. So he saw this direct line from West Africa to African American culture.
Which makes sense given how many enslaved Africans were brought from that region during the transatlantic slave trade.
Exactly. But then you have E. Franklin Frazier, a really important sociologist, who argued the opposite. He thought the experience of slavery was so traumatic, so dehumanizing, that it basically wiped out most traces of African heritage.
So he's saying that African American culture developed independently as a response to being enslaved in America.
That was his view, yeah. Although it's important to say that Frazier did acknowledge the huge role of the Black church in helping Black Americans kind of rebuild their lives and their sense of culture after emancipation.
So two very different perspectives on how resilient culture can be. Where does Lorenzo Turner's work fit into all of this?
This is where it gets really interesting. Turner was a linguist who used oral history to study the Gullah dialect, the language spoken by descendants of enslaved Africans living on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia.
Right, right.
His research, which came out in 1949, really provided evidence for Herskovits' side of the debate.
Yeah, I can see that. Isolated communities often hold on to traditions more strongly. What exactly did Turner find in the Gullah dialect that was so significant?
He found actual Africanisms in the language itself, like specifically derivations from the Niger-Congo and Bantu language families. So we're talking about distinct words, grammatical structures, even speech patterns that had direct links to specific African languages.
Wow, so his work showed that African linguistic influences didn't just survive, but actually thrived in America.
Exactly. It challenged this assumption that enslaved people had completely lost their languages. And it kind of leads us to another layer of this whole thing. The origins of those enslaved Africans, they weren't static, right? They shifted over time.
Okay, how so?
Well, early on, like in the 17th century, most of the enslaved Africans who ended up in South Carolina, for example, were coming from the Senegambia region. So groups like the Gullah, Fulani, Mande, Bambara peoples.
So a real mix of cultures even within that one region. Did planters have preferences for certain groups?
They did, and it often came down to really ingrained biases, unfortunately. For example, the Gullah, Fulani, and Mande people were often seen as having lighter skin and being, more docile.
So more likely to be put to work as house servants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that meant more interaction with European Americans, more pressure to acculturate, and maybe a greater loss of their original languages and customs because of it.
That makes sense. So where do the Bantu people who Turner connected to the Gullah language fit into all of this?
So by the 18th century, you start to see a huge influx of Bantu people, mostly from the Congo-Angola region, and they were seen as strong and good for agricultural work. So
more likely to be working in the fields.
Exactly. And because of that, they had less contact with European Americans, which actually created an environment where their languages and cultural practices were more likely to survive.
That's amazing. So the way the plantation system was structured actually played a role in which African cultures were preserved.
Yeah, it's like these traditions were woven into the very fabric of Southern life, even if the slave owners didn't always realize it.
It's incredible. And speaking of being woven into the fabric of Southern life, let's talk about something we can all appreciate: food.
Right. This is one of the most tangible ways, and arguably the most delicious, to see that African influence in America. Think about it. You've got crops that make their way from Africa to the New World, become staples of Southern cooking, and then eventually they find their way onto tables all across America.
Okay, I'm ready. Give me some examples. What are some of those culinary connections?
Rice, black-eyed peas, okra, peanuts, watermelon, all of these came from Africa. and were brought over by enslaved Africans. And it wasn't just about surviving. These crops actually thrived in this new environment.
That's really interesting. I'm guessing planters weren't exactly like, let's make some African food. So how did these ingredients become so ingrained in Southern food culture?
It was mostly practicality. They realized these crops would grow well in the southern climate and could feed the people they enslaved. But I doubt they had any idea they were also planting the seeds, so to speak, for some of America's most iconic dishes.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about all that knowledge and tradition that must have crossed the Atlantic with them.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about knowing what to plant, right? We're talking cooking techniques, flavor combinations, these traditions tied to food and how to prepare it. These things were passed down through generations and really shaped the way Southern food developed.
This deep dive is already making me hungry, but before we take a food break, we have to talk about language. That feels like such a complex area when it comes to cultural influence.
It really is. And the development of African-American English, what's often called Ebonics, is a perfect example of both cultural adaptation and this amazing way of preserving culture despite the odds.
Yeah, and there's been this whole debate about whether Ebonics is its own language or just like bad English. What do you think?
It's definitely more nuanced than that, and it's not fair to simplify it. Think about it. Enslaved Africans were forced to learn English to communicate with their captors and each other. But they weren't starting from scratch. They brought their own languages and ways of speaking with them. And it wasn't just about, vocabulary. Remember Lorenzo Turner's research on the Gullah dialect. He found that African languages, particularly from the Niger-Congo family, probably had a big influence on the way Ebonics is structured grammatically.
Now that you mention it, I remember reading something about how done is used in Ebonics. It's not just a simple past tense.
You got it. In Ebonics, you often hear done used as what linguists call a completive aspect marker. Instead of just saying, he finished his work, you might hear, he done finished his work. And that's similar to how done works in West African Pidgin English. It points to this grammatical structure you find in a lot of Niger-Congo languages, and it really challenges that idea that Ebonics is just flawed English.
It's amazing how easy it is to miss those deeper connections. It makes you wonder what other bits of African languages might be hidden within American English.
Definitely. It's a fascinating area of study. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about names. That's another way these cultural connections pop up.
Okay, what about names?
Turner also found that enslaved Africans would use what were called day names.
Day names? What are those?
So basically, it was the practice of giving children names based on the day of the week they were born. It was really common in West African cultures. Like a child born on Sunday might be called Kwashi, which is similar to the Ashanti word for Sunday. Over time, a lot of those day names were replaced with English equivalents. But just the tradition itself shows how important it was to hold on to those cultural ties.
Yeah, it makes you think about how meaningful names are, how they can connect us to our past, even across generations and continents.
For sure. And this brings us to a really interesting guy, Paul Cuffey.
Cuffey? I don't recognize that name.
Paul Cuffey was this amazing guy, a really successful shipbuilder, a big abolitionist, and he was of both African and Native American descent. And here's the thing. He was born on a Friday and given the African day name Cuffey, and he kept that name his entire life.
Wow, that's powerful. He achieved so much, and he did it all while keeping his African name. What a statement.
It really shows just how complicated the relationship between identity and holding on to your culture was during this period. While a lot of people were stripped of their African names and forced to take European ones, Cuffey's story is a reminder that holding on to those names could be a way to resist, a way to honor your heritage when society wanted to erase it.
It really makes you wonder just how many stories of resistance and cultural survival are still out there waiting to be told.
It really does. Yeah. And it kind of brings us to another aspect of African culture that survived through slavery, and that's spirituality.
Okay, now we're getting into something I'm really curious about. How did enslaved Africans maintain their spiritual traditions, especially with everything they went through?
It really speaks to human resilience and the power of faith. And we can't really talk about African spirituality in America without understanding spirit possession.
I was just thinking that. It's not something you hear about every day. Can you explain what it is?
Sure. So, spirit possession is this idea that spirits can, temporarily inhabit a person's body, kind of influencing their actions, their speech. It's seen as a way to communicate with the spirits, to ask for guidance, sometimes even to heal.
And this practice survived the journey across the Atlantic and took root in America.
It did. And you see it in voodoo and Santeria, both of which have strong connections to West African traditions. In voodoo, spirit possession is a big part of how practitioners connect with the Loa, the spirits that are part of the voodoo pantheon.
So spirit possession is like a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world.
Right. It lets them have that direct contact with these spiritual forces.
So do you have to do something special, like a ceremony, to experience spirit possession?
It depends on the specific tradition and the spirits that are being called upon, but music and dance are often a big part of it. Like, imagine rhythmic drumming, chanting, these specific movements that all build up to create this trance-like state. And that allows people to open themselves up to being possessed by a spirit.
Wow, it's like they're setting the stage for the spirit to enter the physical world.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really cool. You can see the connections to Africa right there in the ceremonies themselves. The songs they use in voodoo rituals often combine African words with Creole. So you see how language, music, and spirituality are all tied together.
That makes sense, right? Language has this way of connecting us to something bigger than ourselves, to our history. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, for sure. Some voodoo songs call upon this figure called Papa Legba, which is a name that comes from the Fon language of West Africa. Legba's a big deal in lots of West African traditions. He's often linked to crossroads and being this go-between, this intermediary between the spirit world and the human world.
Right.
And so the fact that he pops up in these songs, even after centuries of being disconnected from Africa, speaks volumes about how resilient those cultural threads are.
It's really remarkable how those connections endured. It sounds like voodoo, even though it evolved in this whole new place, still has those deep ties to Africa.
Absolutely. And those ties are even clearer when you look at the rituals around being initiated into voodoo.
Initiation. That sounds pretty intense.
It's a big deal. It usually involves certain rituals, offerings, sometimes even periods of seclusion or training. The person being initiated is guided by a spiritual leader who helps them connect with the spirits and teaches them the traditions. It's this big process of transformation and spiritual growth.
It reminds me of those themes you see in so many cultures and religions, those ideas of guidance, transformation, being reborn spiritually.
You hit the nail on the head. These themes are huge within the African-American experience, and you definitely see them in Gullah spirituals, which we'll get to in just a minute.
Perfect. I've always loved the power and beauty of Gullah spirituals. What makes them so unique?
Gullah spirituals are this incredible example of how enslaved Africans didn't just abandon their own traditions when they were introduced to Christianity. They brought the two together. They combined Christian themes with this distinctly African perspective.
So it was this blending of cultures instead of one replacing the other.
Exactly. And it created something really special. Gullah spirituals often reflect this worldview that sees a deep connection between what humans experience and the spiritual world. Like, there's this belief that death isn't the end, but this transition to another level of existence.
Which fits in with traditional African beliefs in reincarnation or a spirit world where people exist after they die.
Exactly. It's not about fearing death, but about recognizing it as a natural part of something much larger. And this idea shows up in the music itself. You know, Gullah spirituals often use these powerful metaphors and images to describe these concepts. Like, one spiritual talks about the journey to heaven as passing through death's door.
Oh, wow.
It's not about an afterlife that's totally separate from the world we live in, but more like crossing over into a different realm.
That's beautiful. It makes you think of the line between the living and the dead as more fluid.
You got it. And that idea of fluidity extends to how they think about death and dying in general. Gullah culture is all about community, especially as someone gets closer to the end of their life.
Like with the death watch tradition we talked about before.
Yes. Gathering around the dying, offering comfort, telling stories, singing spirituals, it's all rooted in this African belief that these transitions are meant to be faced with the support of your community. It's about making sure nobody has to go through it alone.
There's real beauty in that sense of togetherness, that shared experience.
Definitely. It gets at this core value of Gullah culture, the importance of community when you're going through tough times, especially death. But as we'll see, this way of approaching death, all the music and celebrating, wasn't always something outsiders understood. It often clashed with the more somber, restrained rituals of, European American Christianity. But we'll get into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
It's really amazing how the Gullah people held on to their own traditions while also adapting to this new world, this new life. It's kind of a tough balancing act.
It is.
Yeah.
And being somewhat isolated on those sea islands played a big role in that. They had a level of cultural independence that you didn't see as much in mainland plantations. So that really allowed their unique blend of traditions and Christianity to develop.
Right, they were living in two worlds at the same time. So when we were talking about Gullah spirituals before, it made me wonder about how their faith must have tied into their desire for freedom. Did that come through in their music at all?
All the time. You often see this longing for liberation woven into their spirituals, and it's freedom in a spiritual sense, but also like real tangible freedom. The idea of a promised land took on this double meaning. It represented the Christian idea of heaven, but it also really resonated with their deep desire to be free from slavery. It's powerful how music can be this outlet for both faith and resistance.
So even in their worship, their own experiences and that desire for freedom found a way to make themselves heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think about how this spiritual yearning they had might have been misinterpreted by the people in charge at the time. During the Civil War, when Union forces were occupying parts of the South Carolina coast, a lot of outsiders observed what they saw as the stoicism among the Gullah people, even when they were facing death. There's this one account from a northern teacher who remarked that they seemed strangely unaffected by death, like they thought any other higher race would have been totally broken by that point.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
telling, and it probably says a lot more about the observer than the people they were watching. But it seems like there was something deeper going on that they were missing.
You're right. We have to consider their perspective, their culture. The Gullah people's acceptance of death, their peace with it, probably came from their belief system, that death wasn't the end, just a transition. It wasn't about giving up, but about recognizing that life, even with all its pain and hardship, was part of this bigger spiritual journey.
So their faith, their understanding of death as a transition, gave them this sense of hope and resilience that went beyond the reality of their situation.
Exactly. Their beliefs gave them a way to understand their suffering and to envision a different kind of existence outside the bounds of slavery.
Did they fully embrace that Christian idea of heaven, though? Especially with all the racial segregation at the time, it's hard to imagine them accepting a version of heaven that was just as divided.
It's a good question, and it gets at how the Gullah people took these outside beliefs and made them their own, shaping them to fit their experience. They seem to have modified that Christian idea of heaven, picturing it as this place of justice where everything would be made right and their suffering on earth would be acknowledged. It was a heaven for those who had suffered, a place where things would be equal.
A heaven for the oppressed.
Yeah. There's this one account from a formerly enslaved person who talks about heaven as this state of pure love and equality, a place where everyone would be avenged against their enemies. It really underscores just how important justice and recognition were in the African-American experience.
It's incredible how they took these existing beliefs and adapted them to fit their own experiences and worldview. We've talked about how they viewed death, but what about their actual rituals surrounding death? Did they adopt Christian traditions there too?
While they did include some elements from Christian traditions, like singing hymns, their death rituals were still very much connected to their African roots.
You mentioned the death watch before. Were there any other practices that stand out?
Yeah, one ritual that often confused and even made outsiders uncomfortable was this tradition of a loud shriek or exclamation right when someone died.
Why did they do that?
It was their way of acknowledging that the person had done crossed over, that their soul had moved on to the next world. It's this powerful expression of their belief in the continuity of life and how important it was to mark that transition.
That makes sense given everything else we've talked about. It wasn't supposed to be mournful or depressing.
Not at all. These ceremonies were often very lively, full of singing, dancing, even feasting. This idea of approaching death as a celebration didn't always sit well with outsiders. They saw it as being disrespectful or not properly mournful because they didn't get the cultural context.
It seems like this theme of cultural misunderstanding comes up a lot, how African traditions were misinterpreted or dismissed entirely.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it shows us why work like Lorenzo Turner's research was so important. Understanding these cultural connections is key to appreciating how rich and resilient Gullah culture is and recognizing just how much influence Africa has had on American culture as a whole.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much history, language, culture, spirituality, and I feel like I have a much better grasp of how complex African-American culture really is. And to our listeners, don't stop here. Keep learning about these traditions and cultures that we talked about today. I think you'll be surprised by what you discover. Thanks for joining us.